Hi Flosstube, welcome back to my channel. This is going to be update number 2 of the Organza Diaries, as I've dubbed it, which is basically just following me trying to figure out how to stitch on organza. I'm Jess. I feel like I'm all over the place today. I'm Jess. My pronouns are she and her. Alfie is curled up next to me, probably going to make a nuisance of himself, no doubt. But yeah, so episode 2. Last update I showed you how I set up my scroll frame, how I got the organza on there, how I attached the waist canvas, and where I was going to start. So this time, excitingly, we have started. Yay! So I did get a question in the comments last time about why I've chosen this. So this update is basically going to cover the why, first stitches, and then like a zoomed in view of like exactly how I'm stitching on the waist canvas, because if you haven't used it before, like there are different ways you can use it. So I'm gonna show you a close up of how I'm choosing to use it, and talk you through why. So why am I doing this? I am going to have to insert some pictures because I'm not going to be able to just explain this with words. I basically saw this design and loved it and knew I wanted to stitch it. It's my first time doing a fancy lady. And I think it was John, my husband, that I was showing the design. And I went to the Bella Filipina Instagram page, and whilst I was looking for the release photo to show him, I spotted a reel that they have, which I will insert a still or something from. But basically they had printed the designs of some of their fancy ladies on, I guess, paper or card probably more likely, and they'd basically done them as like cutouts with like a cool display of relevant stuff behind, and I was immediately obsessed. I loved the look of it. So, but I hate stitching on perforated paper. Like it's more enjoyable now that I have the magnetic frame, which if you're interested in that, I think my stitch with me is 3 or 4 videos ago now, but I learned how to include links, so there'll be a link up here to that, to go see the magnetic frame. But I don't think that would have been practical for doing a whole fancy lady. And also just the idea of doing a whole fancy lady on it, they're like 30,000 stitches, this one, or maybe a bit more, but just the thought of doing that much stitching on perforated paper or plastic canvas, just that was a hard nope. So I messaged Rachel, Talking Dog Stitchery, or Talking Dog Stitcher, sorry, and we had a very entertaining conversation where I went, Rachel, I have a really dumb idea, don't let me do it. Don't, under any circumstances, let me follow through on this really stupid idea. And she replied and said she'll try, but she's not the best at dissuading people, which is fair. It is her job, to make us want all the pretty things. But yeah, I then talked myself into a different plan, because I still loved the idea of this being like a standalone piece, like almost not having fabric. But specifically it was the it was the plastic canvas or perforated paper that I was a hard nope. So it then occurred to me, why don't I stitch it on something see-through? And the idea stuck, and it's not paper or plastic canvas, so Rach didn't break her trying to stop me from doing the dumb thing. But yeah, Rachel then, like a couple of weeks later, I think we then chatted to Kat from Cat and Lily and agreed to stitch it all together. So we then had a group chat, and Rachel then messaged me saying, have you seen this Instagram account? And sent me, every time, I can never remember what this person's name is. It's J Favish on Instagram. I want to say her name's Jodie, but I might be wrong. But yeah, Rach sent me her Instagram account, and she stitches loads of stuff on organza, admittedly like smaller scale stuff, but she's done loads of them, and that kind of fueled my, oh my god, this is possible. I think by this point I'd bought some organza from the fabric shop up the road. But yeah, I had a chat with her and she gave me loads of tips and advice, like make sure the organza's really, like, that your tension's really good. She uses soluble canvas. I've decided not to go that route because it only comes in 14 count and I wanted to do this a slightly smaller scale. But yeah, so the idea stuck and I went and bought a test piece, I guess, like just a really simple ocean creature pack on Etsy, and stitched the stingray, which again I'll insert some pictures because I did not think to grab it before I sat down. And that went really well. Like, wow, it didn't. Lots of things went wrong, but I learned from them. They went wrong in a learning kind of way. So yeah, that went well enough that I decided to go for it. So that is, I guess, a little bit of background of how we got here, the why, I guess. I'm gonna jump over now to past Jess, who is going to show you the first stitches going in, and then we're going to jump back to now but top down view, and I'll show you how far I've got and show you I don't know logistically how to make this work, I'll be honest. I've got my up here just out of shot at the moment, I have my tablet stand that I use to hold my Kindle when I'm stitching to show me the pattern. I'm going to try and have that like here looking down, but like I need to be able to see the screen to be able to check that I'm in shot, I guess. So we'll figure it out, but there will be a top down zoomed in view so that I can show you like close up what waste canvas looks like and how I'm stitching on it. So for now, over to past Jess. So here we are. I have, since the last time you saw this setup, I have swapped my sidebars so that this is a narrower setup, mostly just for ease of working with where my Lowry is and the arm of my sofa and being able to flip it over to tuck tails at the end. Added a needle minder, and for anyone who didn't see the last update, I have used these 2 pins to mark where my very first stitch / bead is going to go. So from this tiny bit of the pattern at the top corner, this circle with a heart in it is actually a bead, and that's what would go where those 2 pins point. I have actually decided not to do that today. I'm going to do a separate video on beading once I've got a few beads in a few different places that I can add at once. Not because I mind adding them one at a time, but just for the sake of filming, it's nice to be able to show like, this is how I'm adding some beads that are in the middle of stitching, and this is how I'm adding some beads like this one that are sort of off to the side. So we're actually going to start with the next little section down, which is krienik, because why not? So we've got krienik 002, just the number 4 braid, and I'm just going to load my needle up and we'll get stuck in. Definitely could have done this bit before, but I'm not that organised, so here we are. I'm going to use quite a short length. I think there are a few more stitches in krienik further down this section, so what I might end up doing is having it almost okay. So needle loaded, and I'm gonna get stuck in. I might have to adjust a few times as I realise how I want to sit and where this is going to be. So where are we? If that is my bead, I'm going to start in here. So I'm just using my hand. You might be able to see it through the organza actually. So my other hand is just holding the tail, and I'm quite practiced at doing this where I don't need to flip it over to secure the tail, because I'll just hold it in the right place to make sure that my stitches are trapping it as I go. Okay, so one stitch has now snagged that, so I'm happy to just stitch as normal. So at this level of view, I don't know how detailed you can see in terms of how I'm stitching on the organza, on the waist canvas. I'm going to do another very close-up update to talk through how best to use waist canvas. I'm going to remove these. Sorry, you might get a little wobble while I put these on a magnet on the frame, the tablet stand even. Yeah, I'm going to do a separate little update that's very, very zoomed in so that you can see the nitty gritty of how I find is easiest to use that waist canvas. Get nice neat little stitches. Okay, so that's the last of those 5 little stitches, and I'm just gonna, this is why I wanted the narrower frame, because I can flip it over without having to have it hit my sofa arm. So just flipped it over in order to tuck that tail under a few stitches on the back, and then I can grab my scissors and snip both tails off at once. It's with the organza, obviously once the waist canvas is gone, the background will be empty. So especially on a section like this where it's a very thin, narrow sort of bar of stitches, I guess, it's really important to trim the tails really short and to make sure that I'm not travelling like diagonally, for example, between the bottom corner of these 2 stitches, because that will show through on the organza. So let's mark that off on the pattern. Our first stitches are done, yay! Which means we're 0.01%. I think that's probably a roundup kind of situation. Okay, so we are back. Alfie is being a proper pestomite today, so we're gonna see how this goes. So this is how far I've got. We are currently 8 days after I started, but I have not managed to stitch on this every day. I've had a couple of other things to prioritise and get done. But here we are. So I have worked, I can't remember when I stopped recording, but I think somewhere in here I stopped recording, and then I've worked across into her hair. I'm basically going down to this is about the 70 stitch down the pattern mark. So I'm not having a hard stopping point, I'm just stopping where a colour sort of naturally stops around that area, and I'm just working all the way across. So I'm going to carry on working in her hair. I'm skipping her face for now because I've not decided if I'm doing 1/1 or the equivalent of 1/1, or whether I'm just going to stick with 2/2, 2/, you know what I mean. It's not really the same because this is 18 count rather than 36, but Hopefully you know what I mean. And then we'll get into the seahorse's head. So what am I showing you? Let me try and zoom in and see if this works. There we go. Okay, so hopefully you'll be able to see it. Alfie is being, right, Alfie off. You're gonna have to get off for now. I can't do this while you're laying there. Okay, thank you. So, try and make sure I'm in shot. In fact, pause for a... Sorry, I'm not sure if that's going to help or not, but I just brought my ring light over to try and, yeah, help. Definitely not going to manage this lighting situation very well. If anyone has tips how to do top-down filming and deal with shadows and lights, please let me know. So, when you stitch on Ada, you will have like vertical and horizontal bars almost of threads. And the horizontal, for example, will be made up of, depending on the count, anywhere from like 4 to 8 different strands, all kind of squashed quite close together. And then there'll be a hole, and then there'll be your next vertical bar. And then the same for horizontal. And the idea is that you stitch in the big holes that are left between those sort of blocks of threads. With waste canvas it's a little bit different, so each horizontal and each vertical are made up of exactly 2 threads, and they're not like stuck together or woven together in the same way that the threads are in an Ada. So you have your 2 verticals, but then there's like a very small gap in between them, and then a bigger gap, and then your next 2 verticals. And then horizontal the same, you've got 2 strands going horizontally quite close together but not quite touching, and then a bigger gap, and then another 2 strands. So if we treat this like we would Ada, then you would go from a big hole diagonally down to the next big hole, and then cross over again using the big holes as where you put your thread, where you go up and down with your needle. Now that is perfectly fine. It is a way of stitching on waste canvas. The downside is because the big holes are quite big. Like if you think about them in terms of scale, each of these holes, just realised, yeah, I'm in shot. Each of the big holes is basically as wide as the vertical bar of threads. So that's actually quite a big space to potentially put your needle through. I do have a piece of even weave here, so let's see if that helps. If you think about it here, you have like, you put your needle between the threads, but there is almost no visible gap, right? So what that means is when you come up in a hole multiple times, the hole is sort of held in place by the threads, by the weave of the fabric on either side and above and below. So all 4 of your stitches, I guess you can see it in here, all 4 of the threads that go into a hole go into exactly the same place, and they go into the exact same place like horizontally as the one next to it and the one next to that, and the same vertically. It gives you quite like a square grid of stitches, right? On waste canvas, because those holes are proportionally quite big compared to your sort of bar of threads, there is a lot more wiggle room. So if, for example, and I'm gonna be upfront, my stitching on this is not perfect. I do not always get it completely right. But when you go into the big hole, if you happen to be in, say, the top left corner for one stitch, and the bottom left corner for another, you potentially end up with a bit of a gap where your 4 crosses that sort of corner onto that hole aren't meeting up in the middle. Or you end up with a situation, in fact, this is quite a handy way to explain it. You end up with a situation where instead of your X being, maybe not, because magnets aren't perfect. But instead of your X being perfectly straight, you end up with one of the legs wonky because maybe in one corner you've gone quite high in the hole and the other corner you've gone quite low. So instead of getting a perfect X where the holes sort of hold it in shape, you end up, that went really not as planned, but you end up with your X's being a little bit wonky, and then it looks less uniform and less neat. So my solution to this is, instead of going into the big holes, you go into the teeny tiny gap, like so. I don't know how easy that's going to be to see. But you go into the teeny tiny gap in between the two vertical strands and in between the two horizontal strands. And what that does is give you a much, much smaller target. So if you struggle with eyesight, this might not be the strategy for you, if I'm being completely honest. But if you go into that middle hole, the teeny tiny hole where your threads of your fabric cross over, it's a much smaller target, so your X's are much more precise. Now, the challenge with this is, as soon as you go through it, if you go through with a needle with a larger eye, so my standard, I'll get hold of it on the needle minder. My standard needle that I would use is a size 28, so that is already pretty small, and I'll use that on basically any and every fabric size. But what I found is, on this, I need to use a beading needle. So a beading needle, I have no idea if this is showing up. It's quite hard to tell. Where is... There we go. So hopefully you'll be able to see the beading needle doesn't have like any additional width at the eye. The eye is sort of contained within the standard width of the needle. So the benefit of that is, when you do go through that teeny tiny hole, you're not stretching it. You'll be able to see, I'm trying to spot a good place. So in here, for example, in her hair, you might be able to see that there's quite like a V shape almost to those strands of the waste canvas. And that's where for a while, I picked up the wrong needle. I was using the size 28 needle, and that's just stretched out that tiny hole, which is fine. I've already put a couple of stitches in it, so I'll use the corner of the stitches as my guide when I put in the stitches next to it. But you can see down here, for example, it's still a tiny bit there because there are now 4 strands of thread going through that tiny hole, but the V shape is much less prominent, and it just makes it a little bit easier to keep track of where my next stitch is meant to be going. So that is the, I guess, verbal explanation of how I stitch on this. I'm going to pause for a second and get my needle loaded up, and then I will show you it in action. Okay, so before I actually put some stitches in, I just want to also mention the way that I thread my needle. I appreciate that if you're watching this, you probably already stitch and you know how to thread a needle, but I think the way that I do this is a fairly underrated method, and it has a lot of benefits. So, make sure I'm in shot. There we go. So when I am stitching with 2 strands of thread, I will almost do the opposite of a loop start. So if I open this up, you can see what I've done. So I have threaded a single strand through my needle. Put it down and hopefully it'll focus properly. Oh, hopefully you can see that. So I have threaded a single strand through the eye of my needle and then folded it in half. So the needle is essentially trapped in the loop of the thread. This does mean you can't do loop start because your loop is effectively at the wrong end of the thread. But the big upside of this, there's several. One is that once you've started your stitching, you've trapped your tail on the back of the fabric. The needle is basically attached to your project. So if I need to get up in a hurry, if something's happening with Alfie, if the doorbell goes, whatever it might be, I can essentially drop my needle on a needle minder, or like it is now, just on the top of my fabric temporarily. And I know it's not going anywhere. It is physically attached to my project. I can't drop it. I'm really bad as well if there's a knot in the thread as I'm pulling the thread through, and it, like, you know, it unexpectedly gets stuck. I'm really bad for like somehow pinging the needle off into the ether and having to go find it, usually like down the back of the sofa or something. But obviously with pets you can't just leave a needle lying around if you drop it. So for me that's an added benefit, is I can't ping my needle off the end of the thread. The specific benefit for this situation though is it massively reduces how bulky your thread is where the eye of the needle is. So if you think for loop start, or if you are using 2 strands and you put both strands through the eye of the needle and sort of have that little tail, ultimately when you're pulling the eye of the needle through a hole, it's actually 4 strands thick. Which again, with these tiny holes, we want to minimize stretching them as much as possible, just to make stitching the next stitches in that area as easy as possible, to know where we're going. So by doing this, if I pull it tight, I like the thread is almost thinner than the eye of the needle. There's no like big lump that you have to sort of pop through the fabric. It's really nice and smooth, and yeah, I find that really helps. I find it really helps with embroidery as well. I really struggled with my first embroidery projects a couple of years ago, because it was using like 4 or 6 strands and getting that like lump of thread. Like, I guess if you're using 6 strands and it's doubled over, you're actually trying to get 12 strands through a hole made by the eye of a needle. So by halving the number of threads and folding them in half, you're back to only actually trying to get 6 strands through. So there we go, Jess's favourite tip of the day. So we are going to start, it's not all of the stitches, but I'm kind of working up this area here. So I always do my stitches with my bottom leg being this way, and then my top leg going this way. That is really disconcerting having the camera zoomed in that much. Just through practice, I always trap my tail on the back just by holding it and sort of holding it where I need to trap it under my first stitch. So let's just do that. The one downside with this, with stitching on organza and waste canvas, is it is a little bit harder to find the hole, because obviously the organza on the back doesn't have predefined holes that are sort of guiding your needle into the right place. There we go. So first stitch in, and that's secured my thread. Ooh, check frame. I've realised that when I stitch on a scroll frame like this, I have the bottom bar of the frame almost touching me. I don't realise I do that until I'm filming and I'm suddenly off the bottom of the shot. So this is basically it. I'm just aiming for those tiny holes. Because there's adjacent stitching here, it's a little bit easier because I can kind of follow the guide of where the previous stitch has gone. And to be honest, when it's in a completely new area, it's actually quite easy as well, because you've got that visibility. You can see exactly where you're aiming for. Like I said, some of the challenges in an area like this, where it's almost hard to tell what's the in between the bars and what's the small holes and what's the big holes, basically, because those strands of the waste canvas have been moved by the adjacent stitches. I'll be honest, I'm not really sure what else popped through the tail from the other side. Let's flip it over and fix that. So while I'm here on the back, actually, you can see I'm trying to keep this relatively neat and tidy. So I am trimming, for the most part, there's one exception so far, but for the most part, I am trimming any tail ends like almost as soon as they're made. Whenever I flip it over to finish off a thread, I will always trim the tails from the start as well. The one exception is here because there was a single stitch of this colour, so it's currently securing itself, but until I do more stitches down here that will secure the rest of those tails, I'm gonna sort of leave that longer tail in place. Flip back over. So I'm gonna just stitch along for a little bit, keep the camera rolling, and then yeah, call it a day for today's video. So I just want to show you what I do if I essentially miss the hole. I guess this is the equivalent of missing the hole in an Ada project. So again, I'm trying to make sure I'm in shot. Okay, so I've come even closer so that I can see what I'm doing in the camera shot as well. So down here I have essentially missed the hole. This is kind of the equivalent of catching a strand of the Ada and not getting it perfectly in the hole. But the challenge is going backwards on something like this is a little bit harder because you've got to go perfectly backwards through both layers of fabric, both the waste canvas and the organza. The other challenge is because of that way that I've threaded my needle, I can't just take the needle off and use the needle to sort of pull up the previous stitch and let the thread run backwards through it. So I still kind of do that, but just with the needle attached, which does take a little bit more practice and finesse, but I'm pulling up the previous stitch, and you can do this sort of, because I've practiced this a lot, I can do it where I'm pulling the stitch on the front to pull the needle through to the back. So just pulling that through slowly so that my needle gets pulled backwards towards the hole. It's quite hard to do this without jiggling the frame too much. So I do that until the eye of my needle basically reaches the fabric, and then I hold the needle as perfectly upright as I can, and just sort of wiggle it backwards and forwards so that the thread pulls the needle through the hole eye first. And again, this is another benefit of using the tiny thread. So you can see that all I've done is just pulled gently straight up, and it's popped the eye of the needle back through the hole. Sorry, brief interruption of Alfie barking at something outside. So that has allowed me to essentially unstitch that stitch. My needle is still threaded in the same way, and I can basically just go again and be more careful this time. So in fairness, I didn't need to undo that second upwards. Let me try and explain that again. It was where my needle had come up that was wrong, so I could have just done that the once to pull the needle back through to the back. I've only pulled it back through to the front to show you how that works. But it allows me to undo a stitch and reposition it. If I've got to undo more than like 2 stitches, I would probably just snip the thread off the needle, to be completely honest, and do it the traditional way. But if it's literally 1 stitch like that, or if it's just a slight misplacement of the needle, like I've just missed the hole, then yeah, I'll do it that way and sort of unstitch it in reverse. You can come back up. Come on. Come on. You're interested, are you? Okay, so I'm going to stop there for now. Hopefully you found that interesting and useful. Let me know if you've ever stitched on waste canvas like this. I have 2 other projects I'm starting in December that will also be on waste canvas, but on cotton, printed cotton underneath rather than organza. But yeah, let me know if you've stitched on waste canvas, what you've stitched on. Like, I know people use it to stitch on clothes, like on the back of a hoodie or a jacket, that kind of thing. Yeah, tell me what you've stitched with waste canvas. I'm excited to know. That is all for today. Next time I come back, my plan is to carry on working across her hair and face and the seahorse's head. So the next time I come back and film, I will do I'll talk you through how I'm doing beading. I'm leaving all of that until like all the cross stitches are in, to do the beading on that sort of strip at once. And then yeah, so beading next, and then we will be pulling that first layer of waste canvas, which I'm really excited for. So I'll leave you there for now, and I'll see you next time. Bye for now. Alfie says bye too. You gonna wave? Yeah.